Well, today, November 15th, 2023, is an amazing day in Excel history because we have the GROUPBY function to create a report like this rather than making a formula like this. And we have a pivot table function that's absolutely amazing, all with a formula, and not having to do a crazy formula like this to create a pivot table report. Not only that, but it gets better. If we wanted to spill row totals, well, it wasn't that hard, but we needed to use Lambda inside of by row. No more. Now we use by row and simply type sum, and it spills the total. So in this first video of 3 videos coming up, we'll talk about the GROUPBY function. All right, we're going to start with the GROUPBY function. Next video, we'll do PivotBy. And both functions make reports like pivot tables. Now, GROUPBY only has a row field. As we'll see next video, PivotBy has row and column fields. Now, looking at the arguments for PivotBy and GROUPBY, the first row field's exactly the same. Notice column fields is in PivotBy, but not GROUPBY. Then we have values. Then we have function. Then we have field headers. So far, all the same except for column fields. And then total depth in GROUPBY. Notice because we have row and column, there are 2 total depths in PivotBy. Sort order, there are also 2 sort orders inside of PivotBy. And finally, filter array, exactly the same. That means everything we learn in this video about GROUPBY applies to PivotBy also. Now here's how easy it is. We want a regional sales total report. We're going to highlight the region column, including the field name, so the function understands there's a field name. Now I've already created a defined name for each one of the columns. That's region. For the values argument, we'll use the sales column. And the function is going to be sum. Now when I Control Enter, that is amazing. It went and got from the region column a unique list. And from the sales column, it used this unique list as conditions or criteria, calculated the conditional totals, and then added a total row. Now, we're using the sum function in this example, but here are all the functions available in the dropdown. 16 functions, and some of them are brand new, not in a pivot table. Percent of, median, array to text, concat, and mode.single. And we'll take a look at percent of and array to text in a later example. Now, the function argument is usually where the Lambda function goes. But these 16 functions are allowed in the function arguments of this function and others without having to use the Lambda function. And I'll show you an example coming up. Now let's look at the remaining arguments, F2, backspace. And when I type a comma, we get to field headers. These refer to the headers over in the data set. No headers mean it doesn't have headers. Yes, but don't show. That just means there are headers, but we don't want to show them. And I'll show you a good use for that later. No, but generate. I'm going to show you this one just so you never use it again. Control Enter. It adds those terrible row field headers from the old default settings in a pivot table. F2, backspace. The one we want is yes, we have headers here, and please show. 3, close parentheses, and Control Enter. And there it is. Just as the argument says F2 field headers, it showed the field headers. But guess what? It doesn't show a calculation label to let us know that this is a sum. Now, I'll show you how to get around this later. F2, backspace, comma. The next argument is total depth. No totals. That's if you don't want the total row. Grand totals, that's the default. If you have more than one field in the row area, then you can show grand and subtotals. You can even show them at the top. And -1, that's 1 for grand totals, but -1 for grand totals at the top. We'll definitely look at subtotals later, comma, sort order. Here, we count 1, 2. That's the second column in the report, and we want to sort it. If we put +2, it goes smallest to biggest, ascending, F2. And if we put a -2, This tells it descending biggest to smallest. So we'll leave it biggest to smallest. F2, backspace. Now, I'll show you other examples later, but a quick example here. Filter array, this argument works exactly like the include argument in the filter function. You build some logical test that'll deliver trues and falses to say which records to exclude. So we're going to say this column, region, and we'll say not equal to, that's less than, greater than. That's the comparative operator for not. And we want to say not west. Close parentheses, Control Enter, and now the report does not show west. Now Control Z to undo that. Another important thing about this amazing function is that says function right there. That's usually where you put a lambda. And guess what? You can put a lambda here. So you can create any type of aggregate calculation that you would like that's not one of those 16 functions. Now, this is a substitute for what? A lambda. Here's how we would have to do it if we didn't have the amazing drop down with those 16 functions. We'd have to define a variable and say which calculation should be calculated in each row. Now here we want to try percentage of. For this function, percentage of is not as versatile as the pivot table. It's going to work on sum. So when I do that, there's the percent of this total over here. Now this function, as far as I can tell, does not have the ability to have two different functions. But I'll show you a way to get around that. But for a regional percent of sales report, that is amazing. Just look at how quick and easy that is to create. Maybe it's even faster than a pivot table. Obviously, the disadvantage is this doesn't come with formatting, although I will show you how to do conditional formatting. But why do we use formulas instead of pivot tables? We want things to instantly update. If I change this to something different, instantly, there it is. Control Z. Now our next example of group by, we want to see two fields in the row area, two different calculations. Then we're going to add headers so we don't get a situation like this. We'll look at subtotals and how to format this group by report. Now right here we have one field and one calculation. So we'll start off. You got to highlight those field names. We want to summarize by region and sales rep. When I Control Enter, sure enough, that worked. It listed both field names. It's still missing a calculation description here. Here are all the East, then Midwest. And within each region, we have automatically by default sorted ascending. And we have this single calculation, F2. I don't want sum. I want average. So we'll try this aggregate function, Control Enter. Now here's the real problem with not having a label. Yes, we could put a label at the top, but we don't know what those numbers mean. It should say average of sales. Now, before we add a proper label, F2, let's add a second calculation. So we're going to do sales and cost of goods sold. We have field names, Control-Shift-Down arrow, and all the numbers. When I Control Enter, there's the two fields. Here's the two calculations. Now, F2, that average function is going to work across all columns that we add. There's no internal way inside this function or pivot by to create two different calculations. Now, I'll show you a way to get around that later using some other functions. Now, we need to change the field headers. And if we were to use 0 here, it actually would treat this as a record, and this would be an extraneous record. So the one we want is yes, but don't show. Yes, it has field names, but we're not going to show them, so we can add our own. So 1, Control Enter. Now, we have no headers, F2. What we want to use is we want to stack headers on top of the report. So the way we do that is VSTCK, Alt, Enter, Enter to add 2 lines. And array 1, we want to create using array syntax. Curly brackets house the array. We have text, so we're going to use double quote. And we're going to use a comma. In array syntax, comma means spill across the columns. If you use a semicolon, it means spill down the rows. Now, the way I remember that is comma starts with C and so does column. Now we have the second field name, comma, and now we create our calculation labels. Average sales, comma, and we'll add average cost, and then we close off the housing of the array. And since this is the first argument, we type a comma. There's the second argument. At the end, close parentheses, Control Enter, and bam, there it is. We have calculations that are easy to interpret. Now let's look at subtotals, F2. After field headers, comma. We want grand totals and subtotals, so we're going to put a 2, Control Enter. And there's our report. Region East, sales rep, average cost and sales. There's the average for overall East. Midwest, and there's the average for all the sales. F2, what if we put minus? That means the grand total is going to be at the top. And sure enough, there it is. Control Z. Now, we want to add some conditional formatting. And since this is always going to be the top of the report, I'm just going to Control B. We don't need to conditionally format that. I'm going to highlight a few rows below, or however many below I need to accommodate expanding and contracting. And we're noticing a pattern. Empty cell, that's the subtotal row. So we can definitely get all of those rows, including the grand total, by making a formula looking through the row, but only at the cell and looking at it if it is empty. Now, I highlighted the active cell is in the upper left corner. So I go to Conditional Formatting, New Rule. We want to use a formula. Here's where you create your formula. Now, we have to be careful here because this entire row needs bold. But the entire row has to look at just that cell in the J column. So here's how you do it. Active cell right there. So whatever formula we build here, in memory, it will be copied over and down. So I select this column, and I have to lock just the J, F4, F4. What that means is as the formula starts here and moves across the columns, it's stuck on J. But when we copy it down, there's no $sign in front of the 18. So bam, it can move down to 19. And then I ask the question, are you equal to double quote, double quote? Now, I tried is blank, and that means the cell is totally empty. But this is a formula, and it thinks something there. So this is how we can get around it. That's the syntax we use for nothing. Technically, it actually is something. It is a zero-length text string, but it works. So we're going to click Format, Font, Bold, click OK, click OK. And that is beautiful. And if I add one, this is an X. Sure enough, conditional formatting is working. Control Z. So the bold helps us visualize the report a bit. I'd like to add some number formatting. And so I'm going to highlight as far as I think it's going to go and apply comma. That's much better. Now, I also would like to add a double line to the grand total. So I have my cell selected up here. But guess what? I forgot how many rows I went down. Here's a great trick for conditional formatting. We want to hit the F5 key. This is Go To, and we want to go to all similar conditional formatting. So we click Special, Conditional Formatting. I want to go to just the same as in this cell. Click OK. And now I can remember, sure enough, it was row 44. Now let's use the keyboard, Alt-HLN. Then we want to use a formula. We'll make a formula in that text box. We're looking through this column to find only the row with grand total. So we click in the upper left corner. We need to lock it F4, F4, just the column. So everything in the row where it says grand total gets the formatting. Are you equal to grand total? Click Format. And under Font tab, we want underline. And I'm going to use double. Click OK, OK. And now, sure enough, there's a double underline in the grand total row. If I change this to something different, that double underline knows just where to go. Control Z. Now, we used two columns to make a calculation. But anytime you use a function in the function argument, it's going to spread the same calculation across all the columns. If we want a different calculation, well, then we can use group by and add an extra column to the right. Now, here we have a regional sales report without a title. And what we'd like to do is create % of total. Now, we'll define using the let function this as a variable. Then using drop, we can extract this entire column. Then using take, we can get just the total. And then we'll divide those two and then mash them together with hstack and vstack. F2. We'll use let to define variables. Alt, enter, enter. I'm going to call group by G. That's the name of the variable we can use throughout the formula. Right here, I'm going to define headers, comma. Now, I already typed this out in array syntax. Region, total sales, and % of total, comma. Now, from the variable G, comma, alt, enter, I would like to extract the last column. And I'm going to call this V for values, comma. We'll use the drop function, which can drop columns or rows. The array, well, that's the variable G. And I want to drop the first column. This is rows, so I type a comma, 1 for column, close parentheses. Now, as we build a let formula in a single cell report, what I like to do is comma, alt, enter, and test each variable. Now, I'm going to test H, control, enter. That's looking good. F2. Let's test V, and that's looking good. F2. Now, let's get from V just the total at the bottom, backspace, backspace, and the total I'm going to name T, comma, and this will take just the bottom value from what? The V we just created, so V, comma, and for rows, positive is from the top of the array, minus is from the bottom. And we only want -1, the bottom row, comma, alt, enter. T will test it, control, enter. That's looking good. F2. Now, I'm going to do the final formula, and we're going to build it piece by piece. Well, V divided by T, close parentheses. There's our percentages without the formatting. 1 means 100%. That's the bottom. F2. I want to join that horizontally, so we'll use hstack. This grouping right here is G, comma, and the column I want to add horizontally is V/T. Close, control, enter. That's looking good. Now I just need to vertically add the headers, F2. So VStack tab, array 1, H. Those are the headers right there, comma. There's array 2. Close parentheses, control, enter. And there's our formula. If I add Z, just like that, it is working. Control Z. Now, we want to scroll over and look at filter. Now, we did not west. And what we'd like to do now is I want to say anything that contains west. So in the final report, it should say west, midwest, southwest, and northwest. F2. So in the last argument, comma, when we use contains criteria, we use the search function. That can search for a subtext string and a larger text string. I want to find west, comma, within column here without the region at the top. And I'm going to highlight this. And if I hover, you can see there it is. Numbers mean it found a subtext or a complete text of west. Value means it didn't see it. Well, what's the point of filter array? We need trues and falses. So we use is number. And like I said earlier in the video, this argument right here is exactly like filter. So control enter, and bam, there it is. It contains west, F2 inside of group by. Sometimes we like to filter by list. Now, the goal is to filter this report and show only the regions in this list. And the way we're going to do that is in the filter argument, we're going to look up every single one of these items and find out if they're in this list. F2, backspace, comma, and in filter array, the lookup function we're going to use is xmatch. Xmatch, when it looks up something, it reports the position of the item in the list. Now, lookup value, we're going to give it every single item. And the reason we highlight this column is because we need an answer for every row and ultimately a true or false for every row to tell us which rows in the data set we want. Comma, and the lookup array, 1, 2, 3. The only possible answers are NA, I didn't find it over here, or 1, 2, or 3. Close parentheses. And when I highlight this and hover, there it is. 1s, 2s, and 3s. Those represent the rows that we want to filter and keep. The NAs, those are the rows we don't want. Since we're interested in numbers, we use isNumber. Close. And if we highlight this and hover, there it is. A column of trues and falses that represent the exact rows we want in our report. So close, Control Enter, and bam, there it is, just the regions that are in our list. If I change this to Midwest, just like that, the report reflects that change. Now, both search in our last filter and xmatch, we were interested in numbers. But what if you wanted the items that were not in this list? Well, instead of isNumber, we're interested in the NA, so isNA. Control Enter, and those are the regions that are not in this list. Now, what if you wanted some calculation that was not one of the 16 functions? As we saw earlier, sum is a replacement for lambda. But we can put any lambda we want inside of the function argument. Now, for this report, what we would like is to show a unique list of sales reps and then a unique list of sorted products that they sold. Well, that sounds like the perfect job for array to text. So we'll put that into function, close, close, Control Enter. The problem is it gives us all the products, and they're not sorted. F2, so this is the perfect situation for defining a function with lambda in the function argument. Lambda, open parentheses. Now, what we're doing is we're actually going to iterate over sales rep names and pick out every single product from this column. So we need a variable or a parameter. I'm going to call that variable R. Then anytime we need to reference sales rep to get the products, we use R, comma. Now we're going to make the calculation. Well, we are going to use array to text, because what that does is it takes every item and separates them with a comma and a space. In array, I'm going to put sort and then unique. And then in array, we'll put an R, close, close on array to text on lambda, and finally on GROUPBY and VSTCK. That's a lot of parentheses. Control Enter. And that's our report. Now, what if we wanted this report? It's sales reduced by 5%. Well, there's a couple ways we could do this. We could do group by sales rep, and then we're going to work on the sales column. Those are the values. Define a lambda. R is the variable. We say sum all of the sales for each one of the sales rep. And then because there's only 6 sales reps, we run the operation multiplication 6 times. That gives us what we want. Now, let me show you a different way. This way is probably calculation intensive, but I just want to show you that we can think about group by in a different way. Row fields, I am not going to highlight the field name, Control Shift down arrow, comma, and values, same things. I'm not going to highlight the field name. And for this field right here, since we don't have a field name, it's all numbers. We can multiply by 0.95, comma, and then we can just use sum. Again, this calculation of multiplication is going to have to happen on each row, which is a lot of operations. Close parentheses, Control Enter, and we get exactly the same result. All right, we saved the best example for last. We would like to create a report based on these inputs. That way we can select the variable for the row area, whatever column we want to make a calculation on, and we're going to try to pick the function, F2. All right, instead of region, we're going to look up a column, and we can do that with XLOOKUP. We're going to look up region, comma, within that range there, comma. We highlight all the values, Control backspace. So when it finds a match, XLOOKUP will return all the values. Close parentheses. We'll do the same for sales. We're looking up sales, comma, within these two, comma, trying to return a column. Close parentheses. Now, before we try the function, let's try this. Control Enter. F2. I forgot that when I highlighted these, we didn't have field names. You could see there was a duplicate because it thought this was the field name. We're going to change this to 0. Control Enter. That is looking beautiful. If I change this to sales rep, wow. Product, and it is dynamic. Here's the problem. If I try this, and we'll just hover over this and see what it gives you. It gives you a value error. If you hover over text, it doesn't give you a value error. So I'm not quite sure what kind of thing or item this is in Excel, but I'm going to try it. I know that that's text, right? Control Enter, value. So I'm not quite sure how to link this because I'm not sure what SUM really is. I don't know what to put here to get it to dynamically change. But now we can look at cost of goods sold, and bam. Now, of course, F2, we would like to add labels to the top. We have the second array right there, but guess what? We're going to use HStack. We're going to say whatever the field is, comma, whatever the values are, close, comma. At the end, close parentheses, Control Enter. And let's check this out. If I change cost of good to sales, well, that's beautiful. It changed, but we do have a problem. F2. I'm going to join before this, in quotes, total space, and join it. And that's, I'm going to put total sales or cost because this is hard-coded in. And bam, that will work. I changed it to cost of goods sold. That works. We want to go back to region, and our report is updating. All right, in this video, we learned all about group by. We learned about each one of the arguments, and in particular in function, we saw that there are 16 functions built in. That function sum is a replacement for Lambda. Down here, we saw that we can have multiple row area conditions and criteria, and we can make calculations like average across many columns. If we want different calculations, since group by doesn't do that, we saw we can create a let and use group by with other functions to create the report. We saw that we can do any type of filter argument that we do in filter, such as using a contains criteria on a column. We could also filter a report by items in a list. We learned that for some calculations in the function argument, well, there's not a built-in function to do that. We saw another calculation here, and thinking outside the box, sometimes we can still use the built-in function, but we alter the calculation based on the column. And of course, we saw a completely dynamic report. I want to see sales, and just like that, it's updating. We also saw conditional formatting. All right, I can't wait till next video, pivot by, and then the video after that, we're going to see how to use these new functions by row, by call, and scan. All right, we'll see you next video.